The wind whispers through towering pines, and snow drifts silently across the rugged mountains. A soft grey light settles over frost-covered valleys where smoke curls gently from hidden cabins. Tonight we'll wander through a world of frost and quiet struggle, discovering how mountain men faced the biting cold and blizzards that could swallow entire trails. Along the way, you might notice the clever ways they marked paths in snow, preserved warmth, or even found life-saving herbs tucked beneath ice and snow. Welcome, dear listener, to a calm journey into the past, where survival was a quiet art and every choice mattered. We'll move slowly, gently, through these frozen landscapes, uncovering hidden strategies and surprising details of mountain life. If you enjoy this cozy exploration, feel free to like or subscribe for more soothing trips through history. And before we begin, I'd love to hear from you. Share in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. The mountains in winter could feel endless. Snow stretched across the valleys like a white ocean, its surface broken only by ridges of rock and scattered stands of pine. For the mountain men who lived there, this was not a distant wilderness to dream about. It was their world, and in the cold months it could be both cruel and strangely beautiful. When storms rolled down from the high peaks, a man caught in the open had to decide quickly. Where could he make himself small against the wind? Where could he bend nature just enough to survive another night? Out on the open plains there were few choices. The land was wide, exposed and silent, and yet the old trappers learned to see signs where others might notice nothing. A shallow dip in the ground, a bend in the frozen grass, or a cluster of rocks could mean the difference between shelter and frostbite. The first lesson was always the same: never fight the blizzard head-on. The storm would outlast you. Instead, the mountain men pressed themselves into the earth, using whatever folds of land they could find, carving out small hollows in snowbanks, or nestling beneath overhanging cliffs. The ground itself became their first blanket, and the sky their only roof. Sometimes, when the wind swept hard across the ridges, they would choose a spot on the leeward side of a hill. Here, the snow gathered more gently, creating a soft barrier that muffled sound and dulled the sting of the gale. The mountain men often spoke of the strange quiet that filled such hollows, a silence broken only by the creak of frozen leather or the distant cracking of trees. To lie there, pressed against the earth, was to feel the vastness of the wilderness settle over you, heavy yet calm. There were times when no hill or rock appeared in sight, only the endless flat of a meadow buried under snow. In such places the trappers turned to the snow itself for safety. With knives and bare hands they carved shallow trenches and covered them, with brush or branches, then pulled furs over the opening. It was not warmth, but it was stillness, and stillness was often enough. The body, given even a little protection, could endure more than one might believe. The mountain men were not alone in their lessons. They watched the animals. They learned from the way a fox curled into a ball beneath low brush, or how elk sought the cover of timber when storms thickened. A man who noticed such patterns could mimic them, borrowing from nature's quiet wisdom. In this way, survival was never just about skill. It was about humility, about accepting that the land itself knew better ways than the mind of one lonely wanderer. But even as they pressed into hollows, caves, or crude snow shelters, the cold was never far away. It crept in through boots stiff with ice, through fingers numbed from the hunt. The air in their lungs burned with each breath, and the silence of the open country could feel both peaceful and merciless. To pass such nights required more than furs or fire. It required a kind of patience, a surrender to the rhythm of the storm. The mountain men learned to wait, to let the hours drift like snowflakes, one after another, until the sky cleared and the sun's pale light returned. When morning came, the world was changed. The drifts had shifted, trees bent low beneath their burdens, and the tracks of deer and rabbit marked the fresh snow. A man who had found even the smallest protection through the night stepped out into that stillness with a new sense of life. He carried frost in his beard, stiffness in his limbs, but also the quiet pride of one who had endured. And yet, finding protection in the open was only the beginning. Shelter carved hastily into the earth could last a single storm, but the winter would bring many more. The mountain men knew that if they wished to survive not just a night but a season, they would need something sturdier than snowbanks and brush. They would need walls of wood, a roof overhead, a place where firelight could glow against the dark, and so, the search for protection led to the labour of building, cutting trees, shaping logs and raising cabins against the long months ahead. When the storms grew heavier, the shallow dips and makeshift shelters of the open ground were no longer enough. The mountains demanded more, and the mountain men, patient learners of the land, turned to deeper refuge. In the heart of winter, when snow piled high against the slopes, they discovered a strange ally. The caves of ice and stone. Snow itself, though bitter on the skin, carried a hidden gift. When packed thick by the wind, it became a wall against the very storm that created it. A practiced man could carve into a drift, shaping a hollow with careful strokes of his knife or the steady pressure of his hands. At first, the air inside felt sharp and raw, but soon a stillness settled. The wind outside raged and howled, yet within, the cave held its silence. The snow insulated, softening the bite of the cold, keeping the night air just a little warmer than the frozen world beyond. It was never comfort in the way of hearth and home, but it was survival. Survival wrapped in the pale glow of snow walls that caught the faint flicker of a tallow candle. The work was slow and deliberate. A man crouched low, chiselling a pocket large enough for his body, smoothing the ceiling to keep it from dripping, laying down pine boughs or hides to keep himself off the frozen floor. The cave was cramped, the roof pressing close, the silence broken only by his own breathing. Yet in that quiet hollow, the storm outside seemed distant, like a dream passing over the ridges. Many trappers spoke of the strange calm within those icy shelters, where time slowed and a man could hear his own heartbeat more clearly than the wind. But snow caves were fragile things. They were meant for nights caught in sudden storms, for emergencies in places where no other shelter appeared. When luck favoured them, the mountain men found something sturdier. The natural caves scattered along the slopes, dark mouths in the rock, hidden behind trees or half buried in drifts. These caverns became sanctuaries when the weather turned merciless. Stepping into such a cave was like walking into another season. The wind died at the entrance, and inside, the air, though damp and still, carried a heavy warmth compared to the blizzard outside. Their boots echoed against the stone, and the faint drip of water might be heard, steady as a clock. In these places, the mountain men lit small fires near the walls, careful not to choke themselves with smoke, and watched the flames dance across the rock. Shadows stretched and wavered, and for a few hours the cave felt almost like a home. Some caves bore marks of earlier use, blackened ceilings from fires long ago, or piles of bones from animals who had sought refuge before. In a few, the men shared the darkness with bears, finding themselves intruders in another creature's den. That was a dangerous gamble, one that demanded respect and caution. Sometimes they left quickly, choosing the cold outside over the threat within. Other times they settled at the entrance, claiming only a corner of the cave and letting the beast slumber deeper inside. Both parties bound by the unspoken truce of winter. For all their hardness, caves offered a rare gift, the chance to rest without fear of the roof collapsing, without the constant labour of building walls each night. In their quiet hollows, the mountain men could breathe deeply, mend their gear, sharpen their knives, or simply sit and listen to the storm pass. There, the solitude felt different, less exposed, less fragile. The stone pressed close on all sides, reminding a man that the earth itself was his shelter. Still, neither snow caves nor rocky caverns could be called permanent. They were pauses, brief respites in a season that pressed endlessly forward. A man who stayed too long in borrowed shelter risked growing soft, unprepared for the next march through the drifts. And so, once the skies cleared, the mountain men shouldered their packs and stepped back into the white silence. Yet each night spent in such places left its memory. The glow of a small fire against stone, the muffled quiet within a snow cave, the strange peace of lying deep inside the mountain itself. These moments reminded the mountain men that survival was not always about strength or defiance. Sometimes it was about listening to the land, to the snow, to the caves that offered their silence as protection. And as the men walked again into the blinding white of the blizzard, they carried with them the knowledge that deeper shelter could be made or found when the storms returned. For the mountains had not yet finished their lessons. Beyond caves of snow and stone lay the greater task still ahead, the shaping of true homes cabins raised by hand, where fire could burn against the long winter nights. After the storms had passed, when the snow caves had served their use and the stone caverns had given a few nights of safety, the mountain men returned again to the forests. Among the endless ridges and frozen meadows, it was the trees that stood as their most constant companions. Tall, silent, and rooted deep into the earth, they offered a kind of shelter that was not built by hands or carved from the land, but simply given. The mountain men knew which trees to seek. The great firs and spruces, whose branches reached outward like heavy arms, caught much of the falling snow before it reached the ground. Beneath them, the earth stayed drier, the wind less sharp. Stepping into the shadow of such giants was like crossing an unseen threshold. The air calmed, the snow thinned, and the roar of the storm softened into a muffled hush. There, beneath the branches, a man could crouch close to the trunk, back pressed against the rough bark, his breath rising in faint clouds. The boughs above bent low, heavy with snow, forming a natural roof. In this hidden hollow he might spread his blanket of fur, draw his coat tighter, and let the tree itself become his shelter. It was not warmth, but it was reprieve. Reprieve from the endless bite of wind that scoured the open hills. The sound of such nights was different. Instead of the wide howl of the blizzard, there was only the creak of branches swaying under weight, the occasional thump of snow sliding down, and the quiet beat of his own heart. In the dimness, the fire of imagination stirred. He might picture the generations of animals that had done the same, elk bedding under the pines, foxes slipping through the shadows, even owls tucking themselves into the crooks of limbs. In that stillness, the mountain men felt less alone, as if the trees themselves had drawn them into a greater circle of survival. At times, a small fire could be coaxed to life near the roots, its smoke curling up through the branches. The flames, hidden beneath the canopy, cast a faint orange glow that seemed swallowed by the vast green above. Sparks drifted upward, vanishing into the needles, and the warmth reached only as far as a man's hands and face. Yet even this small light became a comfort, a reminder that human presence had not vanished entirely from the frozen wilderness. But the trees offered more than cover. Their fallen branches, dry beneath the sheltering canopy, became precious fuel when the rest of the forest lay damp and frozen. Their needles, gathered in heaps, could be spread as bedding against the cold ground, softening the hard earth beneath weary bodies. Even the sap, sticky and slow, could be pressed into service for fire or for mending. In this way, the mountain men did not simply hide beneath the trees. They lived with them, borrowing quietly from their abundance. Still, it was never safety without risk. A heavy storm could bend branches until they cracked and fell, sudden and sharp in the darkness. A man crouched too close to the trunk might find himself struck by a weight greater than any tool could bear. So the mountain men learned caution, to choose the strongest trees, to listen for the groan of bending wood, to shift when the sounds grew dangerous. And yet, despite the risks, the trees became trusted guardians. To rest beneath their cover was to feel embraced by the forest, to feel the presence of life even in the harshest season. For hours, wrapped in blankets of fur, the mountain men lay awake, watching the snow drift down in the narrow gaps above, the sky barely visible through the net of branches. In such moments, the loneliness of winter seemed lighter, softened by the company of the towering pines. But as every mountain man knew, winter was long, and trees could only offer passing shelter. A man could not always remain crouched beneath boughs, waiting for the storm to ease. The land demanded more permanent answers, stronger protections, and greater endurance. The forest gave them wood, but it was up to human hands to shape it into walls and roofs. And so, after many nights spent under the branches, the thought of cabins returned. The trees that shielded them in storms would soon be cut, hauled, and raised into something more lasting. What began as hiding under thick boughs would end as a home with four walls, a fire glowing steady, and a roof strong enough to bear the weight of snow through every blizzard of the season. The forest, which had so often offered its branches as a shield, soon became something more, the source of shelter itself. Beneath the towering firs and pines, the mountain men walked slowly, studying trunks with the patient eye of men who understood that every choice carried weight. To cut a tree was no small act. It was work measured not just in hours of labour, but in endurance, in cold stiffened muscles, in the slow rhythm of axe against wood, echoing through the winter air. They sought trees that stood straight and tall, with trunks broad enough to give thick logs but not so wide that felling them would take more than a man's strength. The best were often found near the edges of the forest, where sunlight had strengthened their growth and where hauling them to camp would not break a body already weary from the cold. Each tree chosen felt like a silent bargain struck with the wilderness. A piece of the forest given, a chance for survival taken. The sound of the axe was steady, almost hypnotic. Thunk, thunk, thunk. The blade bit into bark, sending small splinters flying. The smell of fresh resin rose into the air, sharp and clean, mingling with the scent of frost. With each strike the cut deepened, a notch opening in the side of the tree. The work was slow, especially with hands numb from the cold and shoulders stiff beneath heavy coats. Yet there was no hurry. In the mountains, haste wasted energy, and energy was life itself. The rhythm of axe and breath became a kind of meditation, a slow conversation between man and wood. As the cut grew, the tree began to groan faintly, the fibres straining against their own weight. The mountain man would pause, listening. He shifted his stance, guiding the final blows toward the fall's direction. One last heavy strike, and the sound came. The long, rising crack of wood giving way. Then, with a deep shudder, the tree leaned, toppled, and crashed to the ground in a burst of snow and silence. The forest absorbed the sound, and for a moment the man stood still, breathing hard, watching steam rise from his mouth. The fallen tree was only the beginning. Limbs had to be cut away, branches trimmed, the trunk stripped to its clean body. Saw and axe worked together, turning the tree from forest giant to cabin timber. The pieces were heavy, each one demanding strength to move, to roll, to drag across the snow. Some men used horses or mules, but more often they relied on themselves, heaving logs with ropes and sheer determination. The snow, though cold and unforgiving, gave one small mercy. It allowed the logs to slide, dragged like sledges across the frozen ground. Each log was stacked nearby, forming neat piles that grew higher as the days passed. The mountain men often looked at them with quiet satisfaction, for in those rough beams they saw not just wood but walls, a roof, a place where the storm would howl outside and they would remain dry within. Each log represented hours of labour, each pile a promise of survival. There was weariness too. Hands blistered and bled from the axe handle, shoulders ached and backs bent under strain. In the cold twilight the men often sank against the base of another tree, staring at the piles of timber through tired eyes. Yet even in that exhaustion there was a strange comfort. To work with the forest was to join its rhythm, to feel oneself a part of something older and larger. The cabin that would rise from those timbers was not defiance against the wilderness, but a quiet partnership with it. When night fell and the tools were set aside, the men sometimes returned to the same thick trees that had once sheltered them. They crouched under the boughs, fire flickering low, and looked toward the dark shapes of the cut logs stacked nearby. The forest seemed different then, no longer only a guardian, but also a giver, offering pieces of itself so that men might live through another winter. And as the wind whispered through the needles overhead, the mountain men thought ahead to the next task, raising those logs into walls, fitting them together so that a hollow space might become a haven. The hardest work was still before them, but the first step was done. The forest had given its gift, and the men, weary but grateful, would shape it into shelter. The logs, once felled and stripped, lay in tidy piles at the edge of the forest. They seemed lifeless at first, scattered lengths of timber resting on snow, yet to the mountain men those rough beams carried a hidden shape. In their minds they could already see the outline of walls rising, the faint geometry of a cabin taking form against the blank white of winter. It was one thing to gather wood, it was another to bind it into a place strong enough to outlast the storms. The first task was always the foundation. Stones were gathered from the frozen earth, stacked carefully at the corners and along the lines where walls would rest. They were not perfect blocks but irregular rocks, placed with patient hands until they created a steady base. Upon these the first logs were laid, broad timbers set flat against the stones. These corner logs carried the weight of all that would follow, and so they were chosen with care, their edges smoothed, their bark stripped away to bare wood. Raising the walls was slow work, carried out in silence, broken only by the grunt of effort and the dull thud of logs meeting one another. Each new timber was lifted, dragged, or levered into place, stacked crosswise upon the last. At the ends, notches were carved by axe or knife, simple cuts that allowed one log to rest firmly upon another. The sound of steel against wood echoed through the cold air, steady and deliberate, as the mountain men shaped each joint. When a log finally slid into its notch and settled with a heavy sound, there was a brief satisfaction. One more piece fitted, one more step towards shelter. But strength was not just in the stacking. The cabin needed to resist the relentless weight of snow, the push of the wind that swept down the valleys, the shifting of earth as the frost rose and thawed. To reinforce the structure, the mountain men packed every gap with moss, clay, or strips of bark. These chinks sealed the cabin against draughts, keeping out the piercing winds that could drain warmth from the smallest crack. The men pressed the material deep, working it in layer by layer until the walls felt solid, the seams invisible in the dim light. Inside, beams were set across the roof, heavy logs angled against one another to carry the snow. Smaller poles were laid over them, and then branches, brush, and finally more earth or hides to keep the weather at bay. Each addition added weight, but also protection. The cabin began to take on the look of permanence, its low shape crouching against the mountain, built not to impress but to endure. The floor, too, needed care. In some cabins it was nothing more than earth, packed down by boots and covered with layers of pine boughs. In others, planks were cut and laid, uneven but steady. Whatever the method, the goal was the same: to rise a man above the damp and frozen ground, to create even the smallest barrier between body and soil. As the work stretched over days, the mountain men felt the cabin grow around them. What had begun as open air and scattered logs became a place with edges, with boundaries that kept the wilderness just beyond reach. Sitting inside the unfinished walls at dusk, with the pale winter sun sinking behind the ridges, a man could already feel the difference. The wind, though it whistled outside, no longer cut so deeply. The fire, though still small, burned brighter against walls that held its glow. Reinforcement was not just physical, it was psychological. Each notch cut, each crack sealed, was an act of defiance against the cold, a quiet assurance that the wilderness, vast and untamed, could still be met with patient human endurance. The cabin did not make the mountain men safe, not fully, but it gave them a foothold, a fragile sense of order, in a land that offered so little certainty. When at last the roof was in place and the walls stood firm, the cabin crouched low among the trees, its seams filled, its timbers braced, its structure ready for the weight of snow and time. The men sat within, listening to the faint whistle of wind pressing against the logs. Outside, the forest whispered and the storm prepared to return, but inside there was stillness. The work of reinforcing was not only about timber and stone, it was about transforming a hollow frame into a true refuge. And though the cabin was humble, rough-hewn and uneven, it was strong enough to carry a man through the long months of winter, giving him the strength to face each new storm with patience. The cabin, though upright and sturdy, was not yet a home. Between the stacked logs, narrow slivers of daylight still slipped through. In the quiet hours, the men could place a hand against the wall and feel the sting of winter seeping in, thin threads of icy air weaving around their fingers. A cabin with open seams was little more than a frame. It would hold shape against snow, yes, but it would never hold warmth. And so the next work began, the slow and careful sealing of every gap. The mountains had no shortage of materials, but they gave nothing easily. In thawing seasons, men gathered clay from riverbanks, pressing it into leather sacks. In winter, when the earth lay frozen hard, they turned instead to moss pulled from rocks, or to dried grasses buried under crusts of snow. With stiff hands they gathered what they could, tugging loose strands of yellowed stalks, scraping at bark where green threads of moss clung stubbornly. What seemed small and fragile in the open air would soon become the very breath of insulation inside the walls. Each gap between logs was filled with care. A man would kneel in the dim light, pressing clumps of grass into the seams, tamping them down with the butt of a knife or the edge of a stick. Where grass alone was too loose, he mixed it with mud, creating a heavy, clay-like mortar. The mixture was cold against the skin, a pace that clung to fingers and hardened in the chill air. Slowly, patiently he pressed it deeper until the wall no longer let light slip through. The sound of it was soft, just the rasp of hands rubbing moss, the faint squelch of damp earth pressed tight. It was not beautiful work, nor was it quick. The men moved from seam to seam, circling the cabin, crouching and standing, their shadows stretching across the packed snow. They worked in silence, broken only by the quiet clearing of throats or the low crackle of a fire burning outside. Yet in this silence there was purpose. With every filled gap, the cabin's edges grew firmer, its shape more whole. The drafts faded, replaced by stillness. The inside of the cabin began to feel different. Where once the wind slipped easily through, now the air lay still, heavy with the faint scent of earth and grass. The fire's warmth lingered longer, spreading across the walls and down into the floor. Men sitting inside could stretch their hands toward the flame and feel it hold, instead of vanishing at once into the cold. These small changes carried weight. Warmth, however fragile, meant rest. Rest meant survival. In some places the men wove the grasses tighter, tucking them like a quilt into spaces too narrow for mud. In others they layered moss, green and damp, pressing it until it dried into a seal. There was no single method, only patience, improvisation, and the constant awareness that the smallest crack could mean the difference between comfort and frostbite. When the last seam was sealed, the cabin no longer looked like scattered logs stacked in haste. It looked lived in, tended, considered. The walls were smooth with earth, their once gaping lines now softened by packed fibres. From the outside, the cabin blended with the slope of land, its earthen seams making it appear as though it had grown from the mountain itself. Inside, the difference was clear. The fire's smoke curled upward in the half-dark, not tugged away by hidden draughts, but drifting gently toward the roof beams. A man could sit in the silence and hear only the steady crackle of burning wood, no longer broken by the whistle of wind slipping through the walls. The air grew warmer, not hot, but warm enough to make the cold bearable. It was a humble victory, small, invisible to the world beyond those walls, but one deeply felt by those who had laboured for it. As the men sat back, weary from the day's work, they knew the cabin had shifted from a shell into a true refuge. The logs, the notches, the stones, they were the skeleton. But it was the mud and grass pressed patiently into every seam that gave the cabin life. It was these small, quiet acts that turned raw timber into shelter, a place where men could breathe without shivering, sleep without waking to the bite of the wind. The wilderness remained outside, vast and unforgiving. The storms would return, the snow would press down, the winds would rage, but within the walls, sealed by hands roughened with cold, there was now a space untouched by the blizzard, a pocket of stillness, a fragile peace. Even with the cabin sealed tight, even with the fire burning in the hearth, winter pressed against the men like a constant weight. The walls kept out the wind, but they could not chase the cold entirely. In the mountains, warmth was not just about shelter. It was something a man had to carry on his very body. And so the mountain men turned to the oldest craft of survival, shaping clothing from the skins of animals. Every hide was more than a trophy. It was a second skin, a barrier against air that could kill with silence. When an animal was taken, nothing was wasted. The meat fed them, the bones became tools, the sinew became thread, and the hide became the shield between their flesh and the frost. To prepare a skin was slow work. The raw hide, stiff with cold, had to be scraped clean of fat and flesh, stretched across wooden frames, and worked over with stone scrapers or the edge of a knife until it softened. The sound of it was rough and steady, like paper being rubbed, a rhythm that carried through the stillness of the cabin yard. Softening the hide often meant rubbing in the animal's own brain, rich with oils that seeped into the fibres and loosened them. Smoke, too, played its part. Hides hung above smouldering fires until they drank in the haze, becoming supple and resistant to water. The process smelled sharp and earthy, a mix of ash, leather, and winter air. Men worked with numb fingers, pulling and folding, bending and rubbing, until the skin gave way, turning pliable under their hands. Once softened, the hides were cut and shaped. Some became leggings, stitched with sinew that held even when wet. Others were fashioned into long shirts or tunics, layered to trap warmth. The thickest pelts, heavy with fur, were draped into cloaks or sewn into hoods that shadowed the face against biting wind. Gloves were crudely pieced together, not elegant but strong enough to keep hands from stiffening into useless claws. Boots were made from layered hides, the soles thickened with extra strips, the tops wrapped and tied with rawhide cords. The work was slow, almost meditative. By the firelight, one man bent low over his lap, pushing a bone needle through layers of leather, pulling it back with a faint creak. The thread of sinew stretched tight, then held. Each stitch was small, uneven, but together they formed something whole, something that could be trusted against the snow. The clothing bore no decoration, no flourish. Its beauty was in its purpose, in the quiet promise that it would help carry a man through the storm. Wearing the finished garments was like stepping into a different world. Wrapped in fur, the mountain men felt insulated, not invincible, but guarded from the worst of the cold. The crack of the wind softened. The sting of air against skin dulled. It did not erase the hardship, but it gave the body a chance to endure longer, to keep moving when otherwise it would falter. The clothes were heavy, stiff at first, but they became, familiar with use, bending and moulding to the wearer's shape until man and hide seemed almost one. There was also a quiet sense of kinship in it. The animals that roamed the mountain, deer, elk, buffalo, bear, lived where men now struggled to survive. By wearing their skins, the mountain men took on a piece of that endurance, a lesson in resilience carried on the back. It was not triumph over nature, but a borrowing, a quiet partnership between hunter and hunted. At night, inside the cabin, the garments were hung by the fire, steaming gently as snow melted from their edges. The scent of smoke clung to them, earthy and sharp, a reminder of labour and survival. When dawn came, and the men pulled them on again, they stepped out not only as themselves, but as something cloaked, hardened, made ready for the next test the mountain would offer. Making clothing from animal skins was more than craft. It was a ritual of endurance, one that turned cold hides into the thin line between life and loss. Each stitch, each softened fold carried the weight of necessity. And in the stillness of the mountains, as the blizzards howled outside, these handmade garments whispered of persistence. The quiet, steady persistence that allowed a man to remain standing in a land that wished him gone. Warm clothing carried a man through the day, but the nights in the high country were another test entirely. Even with the cabin sealed, even with furs pulled tight across the body, the cold sank deeper once the fire burned low. Sleep could be dangerous. A man could drift off only to wake stiff with frost, or not wake at all. So just as they had turned hides into coats and boots, the mountain men also shaped them into the simplest, most essential form of protection, bedrolls and blankets. A bedroll was not complicated, but it was life-saving. It began with the heaviest hides, often buffalo or bear, thick with fur that held heat. These were laid out flat, stretched to soften them, then folded carefully. Sometimes the hides were layered, fur against fur, hide against hide, stitched at the edges with sinew so that they would not slip apart. What emerged was heavy, awkward to carry, but when unrolled across the floor of the cabin it became a shield between the sleeper and the frozen earth. Blankets were made in much the same way. Deer hides were common, lighter and easier to sew, though thinner than buffalo. For warmth, several were stitched together, forming wide coverings large enough for a man to curl beneath. The stitching was uneven, the edges rough, but none of that mattered. Function was the only measure of success. If a man could lie down, pull the weight of fur across his shoulders, and feel the fire's warmth linger a little longer, then the blanket had done its work. The crafting of these coverings was quiet labour, done by firelight in the long evenings when the day's heavier work was finished. A man would sit cross-legged on the cabin floor, hide spread across, his lap pushing a bone needle through with slow determination. The sound of it was soft, the creak of leather, the faint pull of sinew thread. Sometimes the hides steamed faintly, thawing as they warmed by the fire. The air smelled of smoke and raw leather, earthy and sharp, filling the cabin with the scent of survival itself. To line a bedroll, pine boughs or dried grasses were sometimes layered inside. The soft needles or stalks added insulation, trapping air that the body could warm through the night. These makeshift mattresses kept men from lying directly on the frozen ground, sparing them the chill that seeped upward through soil and stone. Pulling a fur-lined bedroll around the body, with a blanket folded over, was like retreating into a cave within a cave. Dark, enclosed, and safe. The men learned, too, that sharing warmth was as old a tool as any axe or needle. 2 bedrolls pulled close, 2 blankets spread across shoulders, and the heat of one body helped preserve the other. It was not comfort in the usual sense. These nights were never truly comfortable, but it was survival. And in the long silence of mountain winters, survival was its own form of rest. The sight of these finished rolls and blankets stacked against the wall of a cabin brought a deep reassurance. They were not luxuries, but promises. Promises of nights endured, of mornings woken to rather than feared. To look upon them was to feel a quiet readiness for the season's long trial, and when the storm winds howled, rattling at the roof and driving snow against the door, a mountain man could retreat into the cocoon he had stitched with his own hands. Wrapped in fur, pressed against pine boughs, listening to the muffled roar outside, he could finally surrender to sleep. His rest was not peaceful, not free of cold, but it was just enough to gather strength, enough to see another day. The crafting of bedrolls and blankets was not a craft of beauty, but of endurance. It turned the remains of the hunt into warmth, the scraps of the wilderness into shelter for the body itself, and in those long, heavy nights, when even the fire dared not fight the storm alone, these humble coverings became a man's final refuge, holding him close until the thin light of morning found its way through the cracks of the mountain sky. The mountain cabin gave shelter, the fire gave light, and the hides gave protection. Yet still, the cold found its way into every hollow and every breath. In such winters, a single coat, no matter how thick, was never enough. Warmth had to be built slowly, piece upon piece, like the cabin itself. This was where the old wisdom of layering came into practice, clothing worn in layers, each one catching what little heat the body made and holding it close. The first layer was simple, softened hides worn tight against the skin, often deerskin shirts or leggings. These were not meant for warmth alone, but for comfort, pliable and smooth enough to move with the body. Over this came heavier skins, stitched with fur left intact. A man might wear a second tunic, the fur turned inward to trap air, pressing against the lighter underlayer. Then came the heaviest garments, cloaks of buffalo, coats of bear, hoods lined with fox or coyote. Layer by layer, the warmth deepened, each piece adding to the whole. The act of dressing was a ritual of patience. In the dim morning light, when the air inside the cabin was as sharp as outside, the men pulled on each layer slowly. The sound was muffled, the rustle of fur, the creak of stiff leather, the snap of sinew stitches strained by use. They wrapped cords around boots, tied belts to keep the weight of the hides from slipping. By the end, their movements were stiff, the layers heavy, but the warmth that built within was steady, protective, reliable. The layering did more than guard against the cold. It offered choice. When working outside, cutting timber or hunting in the snow, a man could peel back a layer and keep sweat from soaking into the skins. When the sun fell and the wind sharpened, he could draw them back on, one after another, until he was bundled again. In this way, clothing became as adaptable as the fire itself, fanned high for heat, banked low to preserve fuel. At night, many kept the layers on, even beneath the weight of blankets and bedrolls. The fire might dim while they slept, its warmth fading to faint embers, but the layers held the body's own heat, keeping it from escaping into the stillness of the cabin. It was not comfort in the sense of softness, but it was a kind of security, the knowledge that even if the flame faltered, a man could endure until dawn. The furs carried the sense of the life outside, the musk of deer, the wildness of elk, the heavy earthiness of buffalo. They were reminders that the mountain gave no warmth freely. Every layer had been earned, hunted, scraped, stitched. Each piece was a fragment of the wilderness turned into survival, worn close to the heart. To see the men layered so was to see figures half man, half beast, wrapped in the skins of the land they struggled against. In the mirror of frozen pools or in the glow of firelight, their shapes looked older than memory, like echoes of an earlier age when humankind lived close to the earth. The layering was not style, not vanity, but necessity, a silent pact between flesh and fur, endure together or perish apart. And so, through endless nights and days of biting wind, the layers became a second cabin, carried upon the body. The walls of timber gave one kind of protection, but it was these layers, soft within, coarse without, that gave another, more intimate shelter. Wrapped in them, the mountain men could step into the storm, shoulders hunched, faces hidden, and keep walking when the snow sought to freeze them where they stood. Layering clothes for extra warmth was not a trick or an invention. It was a lesson passed down through centuries, learned from the land itself, and in the quiet darkness of winter, it became one more thread in the fragile fabric of survival, one more way to hold life steady in a world that seemed intent on taking it away. Warm clothing and layered hides kept the body alive, but warmth alone could not carry a man through winter. The cabin, the fire, the bedrolls, all of these meant little without food. Hunger was the quietest enemy, creeping in slowly, draining strength until even the smallest task became heavy. And so the mountain men turned again to the land, to the hunt, seeking what creatures still moved in the snow. The smaller game came first. Rabbits left delicate trails across the drifts, narrow lines of prints that wound between thickets and under low branches. To follow them was to read a story written in snow, each track telling of a pause, a leap, a moment of feeding. Men set simple snares, loops of rawhide or sinew hidden where the paths narrowed. The waiting was long, the reward modest, but the meat of a rabbit, stringy though it was, brought warmth when boiled into stew. Its hide, soft and light, could be stitched into mittens or lining for boots, proving that no animal was too small to matter. Deer were harder, more cautious, their tracks broad and deep. To hunt them in winter meant moving with silence, each step slow, each breath measured. The forest seemed to hold its own breath at such times, the branches heavy with snow, the air brittle with frost. A man raised his rifle or bow, waiting for the still moment when the deer's head bent to forage through the drifts. The shot cracked through the silence, echoing down the valley, and if it found its mark, the reward was great. Venison roasted over fire filled the cabin with a rich scent, one that lifted spirits as much as it nourished the body. The hide, thick and supple, could be shaped into clothing, while the sinew served again as thread. Nothing was left unused, but it was the bison that gave most, and the bison that demanded the greatest respect. To find them in winter was rare, but when herds lingered on the plains or moved low into the valleys, they offered life on a scale no rabbit or deer could match. The hunt for such giants was heavy with danger. A single misstep could leave a man crushed beneath hooves or lost in the storm. Yet for those who succeeded, the bounty was immense. Hundreds of pounds of meat, dense and sustaining, enough to last through weeks if carefully dried or smoked. The hides became blankets, bedrolls, and coats, their weight wrapping men in layers of protection stronger than any other. The work after the kill was as hard as the hunt itself. Blood steamed in the cold air as knives cut through sinew and bone. The men's hands stiffened, their breath rising in clouds as they divided meat into strips for drying. Fat was rendered for tallow, poured into makeshift containers to burn as light or mix into food. The ground grew red against the snow, a stark reminder of the exchange, the life of one creature becoming the survival of another. Inside the cabin, the spoils of the hunt hung from rafters, or smoked gently above the fire. Strips of meat darkened as they dried, filling the air with the scent of smoke and sustenance. The sight of it gave a deep sense of reassurance. Here was security, measured not in walls or in fire, but in food set aside for the days when storms would trap them indoors. Hunting was never triumph. It was necessity, carried out with patience and gravity. Each animal taken meant another step further from hunger, another day held back from the edge. And in the quiet after the hunt, when the forest had returned to stillness, when the meat hung safe, when the hides waited to be worked, the men felt not victory but a kind of fragile balance. The land had given, and for a time, they could endure. In the mountains, survival was not just about keeping warm, it was about feeding the body with enough strength to see the cold through. Rabbits, deer, bison, All were threads in the same fabric of life, small and large, fragile and immense. To hunt them was to remain part of the wilderness, never outside it, never above it, but bound within its quiet, relentless circle. The hunt brought food, but in the mountains meat could not be trusted to last on its own. Fresh venison, fresh rabbit, even the great weight of bison flesh. None of it endured long in the damp chill of a cabin or the shifting weather outside. If left untended, it spoiled quickly, turning from promise into waste. So the mountain men practiced the patient work of preservation, turning raw meat into stores that would last through the hungry months of winter. Drying was the simplest method, and often the first. After the kill, strips of flesh were cut thin, long ribbons carved from the muscle. The men's knives moved with slow care, slicing against the grain, separating sinew from flesh. The strips were laid across wooden racks, raised above the snow where air could move freely. In the dry, sharp cold, the wind did much of the work, pulling the moisture out grain by grain. Over days, the meat darkened, stiffened, shrinking into tough cords that could be chewed as they were or softened later in boiling water. The sound of wind whispering through racks of drying meat was a quiet comfort. It meant food was being saved, not lost. Smoking was slower but gave greater assurance. A small fire was lit, not hot but steady, coaxed into a bed of coals. Damp wood, often green pine or aspen, was laid across, sending up thick, curling smoke. Over this fire, racks of meat were hung, the strips absorbing the haze hour after hour. The air inside the cabin or the smokehouse grew heavy, tinged with the sharp, earthy scent of resin and char. Smoke clung to everything, the rafters, the blankets, the men themselves. It was a scent that lingered in their clothing, in their hair, in the very timbre of the place. To live in smoke was to live in safety, for smoke meant food would endure. The process took patience. Meat could not be rushed. Too much fire and it burned, too little smoke and it spoiled. So the men kept watch, rising at intervals to tend. The coals, adding wood in careful handfuls. Through the night the glow of embers flickered, and the strips of meat slowly transformed. By morning they were darker, firmer, carrying the taste of the fire deep within. What had once been perishable became lasting. The sight of preserved meat hanging from the rafters was a kind of quiet wealth. Each strip represented hours of labour, hunting, butchering, cutting, tending. Each piece was a promise that, when the storms closed in and snow buried the land, there would still be food to chew, broth to sip, strength to keep moving. To some it might have seemed monotonous fare, the same leathery strips day after day. But to men facing winter's hunger, it was enough. There was also ritual in the work. As the strips hung above the fire, men sharpened tools, mended clothing, or simply sat in silence, listening to the faint hiss of smoke. The preservation itself became part of their rhythm of survival, a task as natural as breathing, as constant as stoking the flames. And when they took down the finished meat, storing it in sacks or stacking it in bundles against the cabin wall, there was a deep sense of relief that they had outpaced hunger for a little while longer. Not every strip would last. Some would spoil, some would be lost to careless storage, some nibbled away by small unseen creatures. But enough would remain. Enough to fill a pot with stew on a night when the winds clawed at the door. Enough to keep the hand steady, the body strong when the storm howled. Preserving meat by drying or smoking was more than a method. It was the quiet act of making time itself bend, of stretching the bounty of one day's hunt into the security of many. In the stillness of the cabin, with smoke drifting in slow curls and the scent of wood fire thick in the air, the mountain men built not just shelter, not just warmth, but endurance, one strip of meat at a time. Long before the first true snow fell, before the rivers stiffened into ice, and the mountains disappeared under clouds of white, the mountain men knew they must prepare. Winter was never a surprise here. It was a certainty, as sure as the setting sun. And so, when the last warmth of autumn lingered in the valleys, the men worked with steady hands, gathering, storing, and setting aside whatever could be carried into the cold months ahead. The forests in late autumn had a peculiar quiet. Leaves had turned brittle, crunching softly underfoot, and the air was sharp, tinged with the scent of pine and frost. Into this silence the mountain men moved with purpose. They trapped small game, dried berries, gathered roots where the earth was still soft enough to dig. Bundles of herbs were tied with cord and hung from cabin beams, their faint fragrance reminding them of green seasons past. Every trip beyond the cabin became an errand of necessity. Fallen wood was stacked in tall, leaning piles against the outer walls, for the fire would eat endlessly in winter, demanding more than a man ever thought he could carry. Each swing of the axe, each thud of a log onto the pile was a small defence against the long months of freezing dark. A cabin could be built strong, sealed with mud and grass, but without fuel, it was nothing but a cold box in the snow. Firewood was life, as precious as food itself. Supplies were not just provisions, but tools. Metal traps were mended and reset, ready for the creatures that would still wander through the snows. Spare flints and powder were kept dry, wrapped carefully in oiled cloth, for without fire and shot hunting would falter. Knives were sharpened, blades tested, hafts checked for cracks. Even the smallest failure in a tool could spell disaster in the wilderness, where no blacksmith waited nearby. Inside the cabin, shelves and corners filled gradually with the fruits of this labour. Dried meat stacked in bundles, hides folded neatly, bundles of bark and twigs prepared for kindling. Clay pots or wooden containers held what little grain or flour might be bartered from traders before the trails became impassable. Each item carried weight beyond its size. Every scrap stored now meant hunger delayed later. There was a solemn patience to this work. The men did not hurry, for hurrying brought mistakes, but neither could they waste time. Each day of autumn's sun was precious, each clear sky a reminder that the storm clouds would soon roll in from the high ridges. They knew how suddenly the weather could change. One morning the ground might still be bare, and by nightfall the world could vanish beneath a blizzard. The trails closed until spring. Evenings often ended with the counting of stores. By firelight one man might untie a bundle of dried fish, check its firmness, then tie it again. Another might sort bullets, laying them out in neat rows before slipping them back into their pouch. These rituals brought reassurance, a sense that they were building a wall, fragile yet real, between themselves and the hunger that stalked every winter. And still there was no way to prepare fully. The mountains always demanded more than could be stored. No matter how tall the woodpile, how full the cabin shelves, there lingered the knowledge that winter would test it all, strip it down, leave only what had been built with care. So, the gathering before winter was never just about supplies. It was about shaping a rhythm of survival, about building the mindset to endure. When the first flakes began to fall, drifting gently across the valley floor, the mountain men did not greet them with surprise. They nodded, almost solemnly, as though acknowledging an old rival's arrival. Their hands were already rough from the axe, their backs sore from carrying loads, their cabins scented with smoke and stored food. They were ready, or as ready as men could ever be, for the long silence of winter. Even with the careful piles stacked high before the snow, firewood was never enough. The mountain cold consumed it with a hunger of its own, flames licking through logs faster than a man could believe. And so, even in the depths of winter, the men had to venture out, searching for more wood, more bark, anything that could feed the fire when nights grew longest. It was never easy. Snow swallowed the forest floor, burying fallen branches beneath layers of ice. The men learned to search by sound and sight, prodding the drifts with the butt of an axe, listening for the hollow crack of wood beneath. Sometimes a buried log revealed itself, damp on the outside but still dry at its heart. Other times it was only rotten pulp, crumbling at a touch, useless against the cold. They sought out standing deadwood, trees long since killed by lightning or disease, their bark peeled back and their cores dry as bone. These trunks, grey and rigid, stood like silent sentinels among the living pines. Cutting them down in deep snow was slow work, the axe biting with dull thuds, chips scattering across the white ground, but the reward was worth it. The wood inside burned hot, steady, with little smoke. It was the kind of fuel that carried men through the harshest nights. Bark was equally precious, though it seemed so simple. Birch bark curled and papery, lit even in damp weather, catching with a quick flash and steady flame. Pine bark could be stripped into thin shavings, its resin sparking brightly when coaxed into life. A pouch of dry bark carried back to the cabin was like carrying fire itself, small enough to tuck in a coat, vital enough to mean the difference between warmth and frostbite. The work was quiet, often done alone, each man moving slowly through the trees, breath clouding in the air, hands stiff inside worn gloves. The forest in winter had a strange stillness to it. The sound of an axe echoed far, bouncing from ridge to ridge. Even the fall of a tree seemed muffled by the thick blanket of snow. Yet in that silence, the men felt both the weight of their isolation and the fragile reassurance that each strike of the blade was another hour of warmth earned. Dragging the wood back was its own trial. Logs lashed together with rope were hauled over snow, the weight resisting every step. Sometimes sleds cobbled from rough timbers made the work easier, but more often the men relied on sheer endurance, pausing to breathe, shoulders aching before pulling again. Sweat dampened their clothing despite the cold, a dangerous burden when wind pressed against the skin. They knew they had to keep moving, never letting the dampness freeze against their bodies. Inside the cabin, the new wood was stacked carefully near the fire, each piece set where the heat could draw out lingering dampness. The bark, lighter and more fragile, was kept in small bundles, tucked in a corner where it would stay crisp and ready. The sight of a growing pile, even if only enough for a few more days, brought a measure of calm. Fire was more than warmth. It was light in the endless dark, a guard against the creeping chill, a living presence that gave the cabin its fragile sense of safety. Without it, walls of timber and roofs of bark meant little. With it, the mountain men could read the night in flickering shadows, their thoughts drifting slower, their bodies soothed by the steady crackle of logs. Searching for dry wood and bark was a task that never truly ended. It was a cycle of taking, carrying, burning, and beginning again. Each trip into the forest was a reminder that survival was never won in a single moment. It was earned hour by hour, through countless small labours. And when the fire flared bright once more, fed by the wood found beneath the snow, the men knew their effort had bought them another night, another dawn, another chance to endure. Even with dry wood stacked by the hearth, the mountain men knew the true struggle came before the fire was lit. Without flame, logs were only frozen weight, bark only brittle scraps. In the silence of the mountains there was no matchstick, no kerosene lamp to offer quick rescue. Fire had to be coaxed from stone and steel, a ritual repeated countless times, each time with the same patience. The flint was carried carefully, kept in a small pouch, sometimes wrapped in cloth to shield it from dampness. The steel striker, often nothing more than a curved scrap of hardened iron, was held in a calloused hand, cold to the touch. Together they were a lifeline. With them, a man could turn silence into warmth, darkness into light. The work began with tinder, birch bark shaved thin or a nest of dried grass gathered in the rare clear days, stored carefully inside the cabin to keep it crisp. Sometimes scraps of rope, teased into fibres, or even a bundle of fine wood shavings curled from a knife. Without tinder, sparks meant nothing. They died in the air, forgotten before they touched ground. Kneeling close, the man would set the bundle before him, breath clouding in the cold air. He struck the steel against the flint, sharp motion sending tiny bursts of light into the dark. Each spark flared and fell, fading almost instantly. Again, the strike, again the sparks. The sound was distinctive. Metal on stone, a ringing click that echoed faintly against cabin walls or drifted out across the silent forest. Most sparks died on bare wood, leaving no mark, but once, then again, one landed in the tinder, glowing faintly, a single ember no larger than a pinhead. The man leaned low, cupping his hands around it, breath warm and steady. Slowly, carefully he fed it air. The ember deepened in colour, red brightening to orange, then spreading through the fibres of bark or grass. Smoke rose first, thin and curling. With another breath, flame appeared, small and trembling. The moment was always the same, a soft relief, almost reverent. Fire was born again. The flame was coaxed gently into larger pieces, thin sticks set across it, bark feeding its hunger, then thicker branches, then logs. The sound shifted from faint crackling to the deeper pop of sap, the steady roar of fire taking hold. Shadows stirred on the cabin walls and the cold receded. It could take minutes, or it could take hours. Sometimes sparks refused to catch, the flint damp, the tinder unready. Hands would grow numb, shoulders stiff from striking again and again. But perseverance was as necessary as skill. In the mountains, failure to spark a fire meant shivering nights. frostbitten fingers, or worse. Success meant survival, and so each strike carried weight. The men came to treat the act with quiet respect. It was never hurried. It was deliberate, meditative. Sparks flew, faded, flew again, until one caught. Watching it grow into flame was like watching life itself, fragile at first, then stronger, finally unshakable. Around the fire, the cabin regained its soul. Meat smoked slowly above the coals. Boots steamed as damp leather dried. Blankets soaked in cold were warmed through again. And as the fire's glow painted the walls, the men could rest, knowing that the small pouch of flint and steel had once more defended them from the endless winter. Sparking fire with flint and steel was never a task to take lightly. It was a reminder that survival depended not on grand victories, but on small repeated acts of persistence. Each flame that rose from tinder was proof of patience, of endurance, of the quiet mastery of men who lived not against the wilderness, but within it. Once a fire was lit, its glow was both fragile and precious. In the high mountains, flames never burned alone. They lived under constant threat from wind that clawed at the cabin seams, from damp wood that smothered the coals, and most of all from snow falling in heavy silence, eager to drown any spark that dared to survive. Inside the cabin, the fire sat protected by walls of timber and mud, yet even here snow had its ways of intruding. Drafts forced flakes in through cracks. Wet gusts swept smoke back down the chimney, sending sparks fluttering dangerously across the floor. Each snowfall pressed against the roof, and the chimney mouth, sometimes clogging it with ice until smoke curled back into the room. The men had to tend the fire constantly, not only feeding it fuel, but shielding it against the weight of winter itself. Outside, it was harder still. When travel forced them into the wilderness, when they had to camp in open valleys or among the trees, snow became the great enemy of flame. A small fire might be coaxed to life, only to hiss and vanish under a sudden drift shaken loose from branches above. More than once, men watched an evening's labour disappear in a whisper of steam, leaving only blackened tinder beneath white powder. To guard against this, they built low shelters of branches and bark, leaned carefully to form crude roofs. Snow piled atop these instead of onto the flame below, and inside, smoke curled upward into the cold air. In deeper woods they carved hollows into snowbanks themselves, digging down and shaping walls of packed white, then kindling fire in the sheltered hollow where wind and falling flakes could not so easily reach. Even so, the battle was delicate. Snow carried dampness with it, and dampness was the slow killer of fire. Logs hissed when laid too wet, smothering flames instead of feeding them. Tinder lost its crispness, refusing to catch. Men learned to keep bark and shavings tucked inside their clothing during travel, close to the body where warmth could hold dryness. A pouch of birch bark, warm against the chest, was often the difference between fire and cold silence. At night, when storms rolled in thick, they guarded the flames with constant attention. One man might stir awake, add a log, rake coals, check that no snow had drifted through gaps. Another would do the same an hour later. It became a rhythm of vigilance, a kind of shared watch, not against wolves or strangers, but against the quiet fall of snow that threatened to undo them. The fire itself seemed alive in those moments, breathing faintly under its blanket of glowing ash. Protecting it felt like protecting a companion, one that gave warmth, light, and comfort, but needed care in return. The cabin glowed faintly because of it, shadows dancing across rough-hewn beams, the air holding steady warmth despite the storm outside. Without it, walls meant little. With it, there was safety enough to rest. The men knew well that snow was not the enemy, not truly. It was the shape of the land itself, the cycle of the mountains. It gave water, it quieted the forest, it fed the rivers that would one day run again. But for all its quiet beauty, it carried a ruthless indifference. Flames and snow could not coexist easily, and so the men became masters of small defences, of shelters built low, of tinder kept dry, of watchful eyes through long nights. And when morning came, the fire still alive and burning, the storm easing into silence, the men would sit close to its warmth. The snow outside was deep, the world buried in white, but the flames had endured. Against the cold, against the weight of the winter's hand, a small light still lived, and that was enough. Even with fire burning steady in the cabin hearth, there was no complete safety in the mountains. The wilderness was alive with other hungers, some slower and colder than a man's own, and some that moved on 4 legs with quiet steps in the snow. Bears and wolves, drawn by scent and silence, were constant shadows at the edges of winter life. In deep snow, most bears should have been sleeping, curled into dens high in the ridges, their breathing slowed, their hearts moving heavy as stone. Yet hunger sometimes woke them. A bear stirred too soon would wander restlessly, drawn by the smell of smoked meat or fat melting in a pot above the fire. The men knew that sound, a low, heavy crunch of snow under massive weight, the sudden pause of night noises as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Wolves, by contrast, never truly slept. They moved in packs across the frozen valleys, lean and desperate in the cold months. Their howls carried far in the night air, long echoes that reached the cabin walls and trembled faintly in the timbers. At times the calls came close, circling, as though the men inside were not hidden at all but marked and watched. To guard against these creatures, the mountain men used what little they had. Fires were kept burning outside as well as in, low watchfires that cast faint rings of light into the snow. Sooty torches might be wedged into the ground around the cabin's edges, their smoke and flame a warning to prowling beasts. Meat was stored high if possible, hung from beams or trees, the scent carried away on the wind rather than pulled straight into the cabin walls. Still, the danger lingered. A bear, once roused, was not easily turned away. Wolves, once desperate enough, tested firelight with narrow eyes, circling just beyond the glow. The men would sit with rifles across their knees, listening for the faint pad of paws in the dark. Sometimes a shot fired into the night was enough, the echo cracking like thunder across the valley, driving the beasts back into silence. Other times, the waiting stretched on, every sound magnified. The creak of a log in the fire, the shifting of the wind across the roof, the distant crunch of something unseen. The fear was not always of attack, but of being worn down. A wolf pack could wait longer than a man could stay awake. A bear's persistence could wear against even the strongest barricade. Guarding against them was not just about strength, it was about patience, about vigilance, about knowing that every hour survived was a small victory. Yet there was also a quiet respect. The men did not see these animals as enemies in the truest sense. They were fellow survivors, bound by the same hunger, the same cold. The wolves' cries at night were mournful, echoing the loneliness of the mountains themselves. The bears' heavy steps were reminders of the wild power that slept beneath the snow, waiting for spring. The men guarded against them, yes, but they also understood them, even, envied them at times, the endurance of wolves, the strength of bears. In the end, survival depended on balance. Fires were kept high, rifles kept dry, food kept hidden. The cabin walls held through another night, the beasts turning back to their own silent paths. And when dawn spread pale across the snow, the men listened to the empty stillness with a kind of relief. No bear had pressed against the door, no wolf had broken the circle of firelight. For one more night the wilderness had passed them by. Guarding against bears and wolves was less about triumph, and more about endurance, about holding the line quietly, patiently, with steady hands. It was a reminder that man was never alone in the mountains. Always, just beyond the reach of firelight, the wild waited. And always the men endured it, side by side with the creatures who shared their frozen world. In the mountains, danger never gave warning. It crept in silence, broke suddenly, and left no time for searching or fumbling. That was why the mountain men learned to keep their weapons always close, always ready, as much a part of daily life as the fire itself. A rifle leaning within a reach of the hearth, a knife tied to the belt even when sleep pulled them down into blankets. These were not choices, but necessities. The rifle was cleaned with patience, its barrel wiped free of soot and powder after every use. Powder horns were kept dry, wrapped in leather, or tucked into small pouches lined with fur so not a single grain would clump with damp. Bullets were rolled carefully, smoothed, and laid in rows. Each piece of gear was tended like a lifeline, for it was nothing less. In the silence of a winter cabin, the sound of a man slowly drawing a patch through the length of the barrel was as ordinary as the crackle of the fire. Weapons were not only for hunting. They stood as barriers between men and the world outside, the wolves that tested the edges of the firelight, the bear that might stir too early from its den, or even strangers who wandered too close to a trapline. Trust was thin in the mountains, where hunger made men as sharp as knives. A weapon ready at hand meant a chance to speak from strength, or to survive if words failed. Knives, too, never left the body. Worn on belts, slipped into boots, or hung at the hip, they were tools as much as weapons. With a knife, meat could be carved, hides cut, tinder shaved from damp wood. But in the dark silence of a midnight watch, it was also a last defence, held firm when rifles were too slow, too loud, or too far away. The weight of steel at the side was a comfort, a reminder that the men were never entirely empty-handed in the face of danger. At night, weapons were laid close, a rifle propped against the wall near the bedding, flint and powder ready. A pistol, for those who carried them, tucked under a blanket edge. Even half asleep, hands would often reach out, brushing the stock, confirming it was there. Sleep in the mountains was never deep, never careless. It was always laced with readiness, a kind of watchfulness that never fully left the body. During travel, rifles were carried slung across the back or held tight in the hand, even when trudging through waist-deep snow. Powder horns swung at the chest, where body heat could help ward off dampness. A man might stumble, might slip on ice or sink into drifts, but he clung to the rifle all the same. To lose it in the snow, to let it fall and dampen, was to risk far more than the fall itself. There was no pride in this, no swagger. Keeping weapons ready at all times was not a matter of strength or boasting. It was quiet discipline, as routine as fetching wood or stoking the fire. It came from knowing that the mountains were wide and merciless, and that a man's life could hinge on the few seconds it took to lift a rifle, to strike flint, to raise steel in defence. In the glow of the cabin, with smoke rising lazily toward the rafters, the weapons leaned close, silent, patient, waiting. Outside, wolves sang to one another across the valleys. A bear, perhaps, moved somewhere in the dark pines. Even the wind itself seemed like an enemy at times, sharp and restless against the walls. But inside, with fire burning and steel close at hand, the mountain men found a fragile sense of balance. They never spoke of readiness as victory. They only lived it, night after night, day after day, their hands always close to the tools that gave them a chance. For in a land where everything hungered, cold, beast and man alike, a weapon at hand was not a sign of war. It was the quiet companion of survival. For all their solitary habits, the mountain men understood there were times when aloneness was a risk too great to bear. Hunting in winter was one of those times. To venture out into deep snow, rifle in hand, without a companion close by was to walk a thin edge. A broken leg, a misfired shot, the sudden rush of an animal larger than expected, any of these could turn a hunter's silence into his grave. So when the hunger grew and the stores thinned, the men hunted in groups, bound not by friendship so much as by necessity. The forest seemed different when several moved together. Their steps fell heavier, their breaths clouded the air in shared rhythm, and their voices, though soft, gave the trees a sense of presence. Each man scanned a different line of sight, watching shadows between pines, the distant ridges, the faint trace of movement against snow. What one pair of eyes might miss, another might catch. Group hunting meant planning. They chose their paths with care, moving along valleys where snow was not so deep, circling ridges where deer might bed down beneath thick branches. Some moved forward as scouts, their rifles cradled in steady hands, while others hung back, carrying packs to hold the weight of any kill. It was slow work, deliberate and watchful. No man hurried in the snow. When game was found, whether deer pressing through drifts, or elk pawing for grass beneath ice, the hunters spread quietly into a loose circle. Each man knew his place, his angle of fire. A single rifle might wound, but several together could bring the animal down quickly, sparing both meat and danger. The reports of shots cracked sharp through the stillness, echoing across the ridges, then faded back into silence just as quickly as they came. There was safety in numbers not only from the hunt itself, but from what followed. Dressing an animal in the snow, cutting away hide and separating meat left men vulnerable. Their rifles leaned against trees, their hands slick with blood and fat. Alone, this work left the hunter exposed to wolves drawn by scent, or to the sudden stir of bear. Together, one man cut while another kept watch, scanning the tree line, finger resting on the trigger. Carrying the kill back to the cabin also demanded many hands. A deer, heavy and stiff in the cold, could be lashed to a pole and borne between two shoulders. Elk or bison required even more, quartered and hauled piece by piece through the drifts. Alone, such a task was impossible. Together, it was merely grueling. Every step was slow, measured, but the weight was shared, and the reward, a cabin filled with the scent of fresh meat, was greater because of it. In these hunts, a quiet trust grew, not spoken but lived. A man might not know his companion well, might share no words of kinship or laughter, but he knew the other's rifle would rise if danger struck. He knew that if he stumbled, if snow pulled him down, a hand would reach out to lift him again. Survival carved its own kind of bond, one forged not in warmth but in necessity. Back at the cabin, the meat was divided, the hide stretched, the bones set aside for tools. Around the fire, the men sat tired, their bodies aching from miles of trudging, but their bellies warmed by the thought of food that would last. The memory of shared effort lingered in the silence between them, a reminder that in a land that demanded so much, even the most solitary souls needed the strength of others. Hunting in groups was not about camaraderie, not in the way townsfolk might imagine. It was about safety, endurance, and the quiet recognition that in the endless cold, no man could carry the burden alone. And so, step by step through the snow, rifles ready, they walked side by side into the wilderness, each man guarding the other, each man giving the others one more chance to see another dawn. The forest for the mountain men was not simply a stretch of trees and snow, it was a map if one knew how to read it. In the blizzards and the long, pale days of winter, landmarks disappeared. Ridges blurred into one another, trails vanished under white drifts, and the compass, when it failed or froze, was no comfort. In such times they turned to the oldest signs of direction, the bark of trees and the steady path of the sun. Tree bark told its story to those who paused long enough to see. The north-facing side of a trunk, pressed in shade most of the year, grew darker, rougher, crusted with moss or lichen. On the southern side, where the light touched longer, the bark was often drier, clearer, sometimes lighter in tone. A man who had walked these woods long enough could place a hand against the bark, feel its texture, and know where north lay even when the sky was nothing but a grey curtain. It was not a perfect guide. Snow could cling to one side, distorting what lay beneath, and the growth of trees differed in the high ridges and the low valleys. But in a world where trails were buried, even small hints mattered. The men trusted the signs, cautious but grateful for their consistency. The sun was a slower, quieter companion. Its arc across the sky was shallow in winter, never climbing high, yet it gave direction with patient certainty. Morning light slid through the trees in the long, cold beams pointing east. By midday, shadows shortened, and the pale glow rested in the south. As the hours passed, the light stretched again, leaning westward, until the ridges swallowed it whole. A hunter trudging through deep snow would glance often at these signs. He would note the slant of light across his rifle barrel, the shadow his body cast on the ground. He would pause at the trunk of a spruce, scraping frost from the bark, and test his sense of direction. A man without such care could walk in circles, turning endlessly until exhaustion claimed him. But those who watched the sun and the trees could stitch their way back to camp, no matter how many miles the chase carried them. There was something steadying in this ritual of navigation. In a life where so much was harsh and unpredictable, storms, hunger, sudden danger, here were two constants. The bark, layered year by year in silence, and the sun, returning each day even when hidden behind clouds. They were companions older than memory itself, and the mountain men leaned on them like old friends. Sometimes, in the deepest storms, even the sun vanished, swallowed by snow and wind. Then the bark became the only whisper of direction. A man would move from trunk to trunk, hand gloved in frost, feeling the rough side and gauging his way forward. Each step was uncertain, each guess a small wager against the wilderness, and yet again and again the men found their way back, drawn not by luck but by patient observation of what the forest had always offered. By night, when the fire burned and the cabin, walls held back the cold, some of the men would reflect on these guides. They knew their lives depended not on grand discoveries or clever inventions, but on humble knowledge passed quietly from one to another. the way a trunk leaned, the warmth of the southern sun on a bare patch of ground, the length of a shadow across snow. Such details decided whether a man returned home or disappeared into the silence of the wilderness. And so, step after step, mile after mile, the mountain men trusted the trees and the sun. They walked not with haste, but with a kind of reverence, following signs written in bark and light. These guides, so simple and constant, reminded them that survival was not about conquering the wild, but about listening to it, learning the language etched into every trunk, every shadow, every turn of the sky. In the deep silence of winter, the snow was both a blessing and a burden. It muffled sound, softened the land, and made every step heavy with effort. Yet it also carried memory, holding the imprint of every boot, every drag of a sled, every path taken through the trees. For the mountain men, who often wandered far in search of food or firewood, the snow became a canvas where they could leave signs for themselves, a quiet trail of reminders to find their way back. A man setting out before dawn would sometimes drag the butt of his rifle through the snow, leaving a faint line beside his footprints. Others broke branches at eye level, bending them across the trail so they pointed toward camp. In thicker snow, some carried small sticks in their belts, dropping one every 100 steps or so, each half-buried marker leaning against the white. These were not grand gestures, but small lifelines, scattered behind them like breadcrumbs in a wilderness that could erase all memory in a single storm. The snow had its own way of playing tricks. A man could follow his own footprints outward, only to find the wind filling them in on the return. Sometimes he would look back after an hour of walking and see no trace at all, the ground smoothed as though no one had passed. It was in such moments that marks became more than habit. They became salvation. A branch cracked at an angle, a stick thrust upright in a drift, or even a deliberate scuff against a tree root could mean the difference between returning to warmth or wandering into exhaustion. When hunting in groups, the men were even more deliberate. One would carve a symbol into the snow with the edge of his axe, a rough arrow pointing forward. Another might scrape a cross into the ice of a frozen creek, signalling the direction of safe passage. These marks told a story to those who followed. Here we went, here we turned, here the snow was deep and dangerous. They were small messages left in silence, a language written in white. Sometimes the marks were not for men at all, but to keep animals at bay. A trail of human scent was enough to warn off deer or elk, yet wolves might follow too closely, curious and bold. So men would stamp deep, heavy steps, widening their path, making their presence larger than it truly was. They knew the wilderness read their signs just as surely as they read its own. At dusk, when shadows grew long and the way home was uncertain, those faint marks became companions. A bent branch glimpsed between trees was like a voice calling through the cold. A scratched arrow in the snow reassured the weary hunter that he was not lost, that his own earlier self had left him a gift. And so, step by step, the man would follow the memory of his own passage, until smoke from the cabin drifted faintly against the grey sky. There was something humbling in this practice. To leave signs behind was to admit that memory alone was not enough, that pride had no place in survival. The snow was always waiting to take a man's bearings away, to turn his mind in circles. Marks in the snow were acts of quiet humility, acknowledgements of weakness turned into tools of strength. And when storms came and wiped all trails clean, when every mark vanished under new white layers, the men learned again that nothing in the wilderness was truly permanent. The forest allowed them only temporary guides, fleeting hints of direction, before reclaiming its silence. It was a reminder that survival meant not only leaving marks, but moving quickly enough to follow them, living always in step with the shifting moods of the land. So, with rifle in hand and heavy boots pressing into drifts, the mountain men left their small signs behind. Each bent branch, each scraped line, each stick planted in the snow was a promise to themselves, a quiet hope that no matter how far they roamed, the path back to warmth and firelight would not be lost to the endless white. The wilderness never offered certainty. Trails that seemed clear one day could be buried beneath snow the next. Rivers that once carried a man's weight in summer could turn to shifting ice, ready to give way without warning. Fallen trees blocked valleys, avalanches swept down slopes, and storms laid heavy veils across the land. For the mountain men, there was no single way home. Safety meant carrying more than one path in memory, a quiet map stored in the mind for when the familiar way failed. They learned to walk the land with eyes not only on the present trail but also on what lay to either side. A ridge might give a second passage if the valley below was flooded. A narrow creek bed could be followed if the main river grew too treacherous. Even when they travelled the same way day after day, they searched for hidden turns, gaps between trees, and passes through the rock that might one day be needed. Survival depended not just on reaching a destination, but on remembering how to reach it again when the earth itself seemed to change its face. Some of these alternate routes were not quicker or easier. Often they were longer, harsher, and filled with obstacles, but they were steady, dependable. When the familiar failed, a man trudging through knee-deep snow might recall a summer walk along a high ridge where the wind swept snow away more quickly. Another might remember a bend in the river where a shallow ford lay beneath the ice, a safer crossing than the usual one upstream. These recollections were stored like provisions, held quietly in the mind until the moment they were needed. In winter, memory was as important as food. To forget a hidden path was as dangerous as losing a day's ration. Around the fire at night, men sometimes spoke not of stories or grand adventures, but of routes, paths their boots had once taken, trails cut by elk or deer, passages opened by old storms. These were their shared maps, sketched not on paper, but in words and recollections, passed from one voice to another. There was comfort in this habit of remembering. It softened the loneliness of travel, for when a man walked a hidden path, he carried the voices of others with him, the warnings, the descriptions, the quiet advice. Even if he walked alone, he was not entirely solitary. The memory of an alternate route, spoken long ago beside the fire, guided his steps through the snow. Sometimes the alternate routes were born of necessity, carved out of mistakes. A man might become lost, wander too far west, and stumble into a valley he had never seen. If he survived, if he found his way back, he carried that new route in his mind thereafter. What had once been misfortune became another thread in the web of safety. The wilderness was unforgiving, but it was also a teacher to those who endured its trials. And so, as storms shifted, as rivers froze and thawed, as trees fell and blocked the way, the mountain men adapted. They did not cling stubbornly to a single trail. They moved with the land, bending as it bent, remembering the places where alternate paths lay waiting. It was not pride that kept them alive, but this quiet flexibility, the ability to let go of the familiar and trust in the memory of another way. Each alternate route was like a candle kept unlit, stored for the moment when darkness pressed too close. The men carried these paths not in maps or journals, but in their bodies, in the rhythm of their steps, in the tilt of their heads as they recalled landmarks hidden under snow. When the main trail disappeared, they lit the memory, and it guided them home. In the end, survival in the mountains was not about knowing one road, but about remembering many. It was about holding the land in mind as a shifting puzzle, where each piece might be used when another failed. And so the mountain men walked, always cautious, always watchful, carrying not just their rifles and provisions, but a quiet atlas of alternate routes, a living memory of safety, waiting in silence until the land demanded it. When the weight of winter pressed hardest on the land, the mountain men could not depend on the same hunting ways that had served them in warmer months. The deep snow, the bitter winds, and the silence of the frozen forest demanded new methods, shaped by necessity and patience. To survive, they adapted, learning how to follow game when trails were buried, how to move silently when every step crunched beneath ice, and how to take only what the wilderness could spare. Animals themselves moved differently in winter, and the men paid close attention. Deer no longer wandered freely across valleys, but kept to sheltered groves where snow lay shallower. Elk gathered in small bands along ridges swept bare by the wind. Rabbits pressed narrow tunnels through the drifts, and the soft arc of their tracks betrayed their passage. The mountain men learned to read these signs as if they were words on a page. Each print, each bent twig told a story, where the animal had fed, where it had rested, where it might go next. Snowshoes became tools as vital as rifles. Without them the men sank waist-deep, exhausted after only a short distance. With them they spread their weight wide, gliding across the surface, able to follow a trail for miles. The sound of snowshoes crunching in rhythm became a winter heartbeat, steady and slow, carrying the hunter further into the silence of the forest. Patience was the heart of winter hunting. The men could no longer chase game with speed, for their own steps were too heavy, their breath too short in the freezing air. Instead, they waited. They watched from ridges where their scent would not carry, from the cover of trees where wind pushed smoke and smell away. Sometimes they waited hours, motionless, letting the cold bite at their fingers until the animal stepped into range. A single shot, steady and sure, was all that could be afforded. Ammunition was too precious to waste. Traps and snares took on new importance. A loop of rawhide set carefully along a rabbit's run could mean meat for the fire without the exhaustion of a long pursuit. Deadfalls, baited with scraps, caught foxes or smaller creatures whose pelts were as valuable as their flesh. These methods were quiet, demanding little movement, and allowed the hunter to spread his efforts wider across the forest. Even the kill itself was handled differently. In deep winter, blood froze quickly, stiffening the animal before it could be carried. The men learned to dress game on the spot, working fast with numb hands to strip meat and hide, leaving little waste for scavengers. The carcass, steaming against the snow, became both a victory and a reminder of how narrow the margin of survival truly was. There was a solemn rhythm to these hunts. The cold made every task harder, every mile longer, yet the men moved with a kind of calm determination. They did not expect plenty, they sought only enough. A rabbit here, a deer there, meat smoked or dried to carry through another week. Each success was quiet. Each return to the cabin marked not by celebration, but by relief. In the evenings, as snow tapped gently against the roof and the fire glowed low, the mountain men spoke little of the day's hunt. Their voices were quiet, their movements slow, for the exhaustion of trudging through drifts left little energy. But within them was a steady knowledge. They had endured another day, another storm, another trial. The winter had not broken them yet. Adapting to the season was not an act of choice but of survival. The wilderness demanded it, reshaping every habit and every method until life itself was balanced on patience and endurance. The mountain men listened, learned, and bent themselves to the rhythm of the cold. And because of this, through nights that stretched endlessly and days filled with hunger, they endured. The mountains offered little mercy in winter. A wound, left unattended, could turn to fever. A cough could linger, deepening with each night until breath came only in ragged gasps. For men who lived so far from towns or doctors, survival depended on what knowledge they carried in their minds and what medicines they could draw from the wilderness itself. The land that tested them also, in small ways, provided for them, through herbs, bark, roots, and the quiet remedies passed down from those who had walked these forests before. Long before the first snows fell, the mountain men gathered plants they knew would be needed. Willow bark was stripped and dried, for steeping into a bitter tea that eased fever and soothed aching limbs. Spruce needles, sharp and green even against white drifts, were brewed into a hot drink rich with the strength to keep scurvy at bay. Juniper berries were collected in leather pouches, sometimes crushed into poultices for infection, sometimes boiled for their warmth against the cold. Each plant was a kind of companion, stored in silence until the moment of need. Knowledge of these medicines did not come from books, but from listening, to older trappers, to wandering traders, and often to the native tribes who had lived with the mountains long before. Around fires, in moments of uneasy trust, they learned which roots could calm a stomach, which leaves could draw poison from a wound, which resin sealed cuts against frost and dirt. It was a knowledge earned slowly, sometimes at the cost of trial and error, sometimes at the price of men who placed faith in the wrong cure. When sickness came, the cabin filled with the soft smell of boiling herbs. A pot might hang above the fire, steam carrying the scent of pine, sage, or wild mint. The sick man lay wrapped in furs, shivering, while his companions dipped cloth into the hot water and laid it against his chest or brow. There was no certainty in these remedies, but there was comfort. The warmth of the steam, the taste of earth and resin, the thought that the forest had not abandoned them entirely. For wounds, they turned to poultices made from mashed roots or dried leaves ground to powder. The paste was pressed against cuts, wrapped tight with strips of hide, and left beneath layers of fur. Sometimes it drew out infection, leaving the wound clean and pink. Sometimes it failed, and the fever grew worse, but even in failure the effort mattered. To do nothing was to surrender, to try was to fight, however quietly, against the long shadow of winter. There were also small comforts, not cures, but restorations of spirit. A sprig of mint chewed slowly eased the dryness of a parched mouth. Smoke from burning sage filled the cabin with a cleansing scent, pushing back the heaviness of damp wood and animal fat. Hot teas, steeped from wild plants, carried not just warmth to the body but calm to the mind. In the endless silence of snow, such comforts mattered as much as meat or fire. The mountain men knew that medicine was not a promise of survival, but a fragile hope. They accepted that the wilderness gave only what it chose to give, and often too little. Yet they gathered, they brewed, they wrapped wounds with care. These acts were as much about endurance as about healing. They reminded the men that even in the harshest season, the land still carried threads of life, waiting to be found by those who paid attention. And so, through long winters of fever, frostbite and exhaustion, the mountain men leaned on the quiet strength of herbs and roots. It was not the cure-all of stories or the certainty of town physicians, but it was enough. Enough to soothe, enough to steady, enough to grant another day of endurance in a land that demanded everything. The mountains taught many lessons, but not all were learned in the moment. Some had been passed down, shared quietly from one man to another, carried like whispers across generations of hunters, trappers, and wanderers. These were the traditions of survival in the snow, methods shaped by long hardship, tested by men who had once walked the same silent valleys and left behind more than their footprints. For the mountain men, these traditions were not written in books or fixed in law. They were practical, humble acts that made the difference between life and death. Always keep the firewood stacked high before a storm. Never walk into the drifts without leaving a trail behind. Dry your boots by the fire even if it takes hours, for wet leather could cripple you by morning. Such rules sounded simple, almost too plain to matter, yet ignoring them often led to disaster. The snow itself carried its own traditions. Old men had said, "Never sleep directly on the ground, no matter how tired you are." So the mountain men laid down pine boughs or firs, creating a barrier against the cold earth. Others warned, "Do not trust a frozen river without listening to it first." And so they knelt, ear pressed close to the ice, straining to hear the faint groan of water moving below. If it spoke too loudly, they knew to step back. These were not superstitions, but practices born from the graves of those who had failed to listen. Among the trappers, a common tradition was to mark the days of heavy storms by cutting notches into the logs of the cabin wall. It was not merely a way of counting time, it was a warning for the future, a record of when the land had turned fiercest. A man who returned years later might see those marks and know when to expect the deep snow, when to gather more wood, when to double his stores of dried meat. Even in hunting, traditions guided them. Some said to follow the trails of deer at dawn, when the cold pressed hardest and the animals sought food. Others insisted that no man should hunt alone in midwinter, for the snow was too deep, the dangers too many. And so, even the most solitary souls sometimes set aside their pride, walking side by side with others, because tradition whispered it was safer that way. There were also quieter customs of spirit. When a man returned from a dangerous hunt, some trappers lit a small sprig of pine in the fire, letting the smoke drift upward in thanks, not to gods perhaps, but to the land itself for sparing them another day. When sickness lifted or a wound healed, a pouch of herbs might be burned, filling the cabin with a scent that felt like renewal. These acts were not about religion in the strict sense, but about acknowledgement. The men knew their survival balanced on something larger than themselves. To follow these traditions was to accept humility. The wilderness could not be conquered, it could only be endured. And endurance came not from boldness, but from caution, from remembering the ways others had survived before. Every act, laying branches beneath a bed, keeping tinder dry, notching logs, sharing meat, was part of a long chain of memory stretching back through time. In the stillness of a storm, when snow fell endlessly and the cabin groaned under its weight, the men often thought of those who had come before. They imagined the same struggles, the same small victories, the same marks cut into logs or trails left in drifts. In those moments they felt less alone. The traditions reminded them that others had walked this path of hardship, and others had endured. And so, step by step, Night by night, the mountain men carried these traditions forward. Not grand, not heroic, but steady and faithful. Each custom, each rule, each ritual was a thread in the fabric of survival, woven tight against the cold. And because they followed them, because they listened, remembered, and obeyed, life in the snow remained possible, even in a land that seemed to want them gone. Surviving the long winters of the mountains was not only a test of body, but of the mind. Food, fire, and shelter could keep a man alive, but without patience, without the quiet strength to endure each day, he could still be undone. The storms often lasted longer than anyone expected. Days bled into nights without a break in the snow, and the silence pressed down like a weight. For the mountain men, this was when survival became something deeper than skill. It became a matter of spirit. Inside the small cabins, time moved slowly. A man might mend the same shirt 3 times over just to keep his hands busy. He might sharpen his knife again, though the blade had already been polished to a fine edge. Little tasks kept the mind from wandering into despair. The mountain men learned that patience was not about waiting idly, but about filling the hours with small acts of usefulness. It gave rhythm to the days, a way to measure the passing of storms. Outside, the snowdrifts grew higher than a man's chest, and the winds screamed across the ridges. In such moments, there was nothing to do but wait. Impatience could tempt a man to leave his shelter, to walk into the storm in search of something more. But many who tried never returned. Patience, instead, was a shield. It reminded the mountain men that the storm always passed eventually, that no blizzard lasted forever, even if it seemed endless in the moment. Mental strength showed itself in quiet ways. It was in the man who resisted fear when wolves howled in the distance. It was in the one who rationed his food carefully, resisting the urge to eat more when hunger clawed at his belly. It was in the man who tended to his fire night after night, never letting it die, though he longed for deeper sleep. These were not great, loud victories, but they were victories all the same, small triumphs of the mind that kept despair from winning. Many mountain men spoke of how loneliness weighed heavier than hunger or cold. Alone in a valley where no sound reached but the wind, the mind could play cruel tricks. Shadows seemed to move. A snapping branch outside the cabin might sound like a predator's step. To survive this silence required a kind of inner stillness, a way of accepting solitude as a companion rather than a threat. Some turned to simple rituals, speaking aloud while working, humming softly near the fire, or carving patterns into wood. These acts steadied the mind, keeping it anchored in the present moment. Patience was also about restraint. A man who wasted his powder and shot in frustration might find himself unarmed when true danger came. One who burned through his woodpile too quickly would shiver before winter ended. And so the mountain men learned to hold back, to stretch their resources as far as they would go. Each log placed on the fire was a choice. Each bite of dried meat was weighed against the days still ahead. This careful discipline was not easy, but it was the essence of survival. In the evenings, when the storms quieted and the firelight painted the walls in amber glow, many trappers reflected on their endurance. They thought of how each day survived was a kind of proof that the mind, steady and unbroken, could carry them farther than strength of arm alone. In these reflections they found a kind of peace. Survival was not just about fighting the cold, it was about yielding to time itself, letting each hour pass, and trusting in the slow rhythm of endurance. The mountains demanded silence, patience, and respect. Those who raged against the storms often perished, but those who built quiet strength within themselves endured. In the stillness of their cabins, with snow piled high against the walls, the mountain men discovered that patience was not weakness. It was the deepest form of strength, the kind that let a man outlast both the cold and his own restless spirit. In the long nights of winter, when the cabin walls creaked under the weight of snow and the fire burned low, many mountain men turned to their journals. These were not grand books bound in fine leather, but small worn volumes of paper carried with them from the trading posts, or stitched together from whatever scraps they could find. Ink was precious, sometimes made from soot and animal fat, other times carried in tiny bottles, carefully guarded. A quill cut from the feather of a goose or crow would scratch against the page, leaving slow, uneven lines. Writing was not simply a record of events, it was a way to keep the mind steady, to anchor thought when silence pressed too heavily on the heart. Alone, with no voices but the wind, the journal became a companion. A man might write of the weather, the endless snow, the ice forming inside the cabin's corners, the struggle to keep the fire alive. He might write of hunts that failed, of animals he had seen crossing distant ridges, or of dreams that clung to him upon waking. In these words the loneliness softened, made smaller by the act of putting it onto the page. The nights were long enough to swallow a man whole. Darkness lingered for hours, broken only by the flicker of firelight. In that glow, the journal's pages seemed like a fragile lifeline. The steady rhythm of writing filled the silence with purpose. Even when words came slowly, the act itself gave shape to time. Each line written was another step through the endless night, another mark of existence carved into the stillness. Some men used their journals to remember the world beyond the mountains. They wrote of families left behind, of rivers they once fished, of towns where voices filled the air and lights glowed in windows. These memories, captured in ink, were a comfort. They allowed the mind to travel far beyond the cabin's frozen walls, back to a place where warmth was not only from fire but from the company of others. In this way, the journals were more than records. They were bridges between solitude and belonging. Others turned inward, writing not of the past but of themselves. They wrote about fear, about the weight of isolation, about the test the mountains placed upon them. Some tried to make sense of the stillness, to measure their own strength against the storms. A few men's journals, discovered long after their passing, reveal a quiet wisdom born of hardship. They speak of patience, of humility, of how a man learns to bend like the pine tree rather than break in the wind. There were nights when words faltered, when the mind felt too heavy to shape thoughts into sentences. On those nights, the journals held sketches instead. A quick drawing of a cabin, a mountain ridge, or the track of an animal in snow. These marks were simple, but they carried the same purpose: to make something lasting in a place where everything seemed to vanish under the storms. The sound of the quill scratching on paper became as steady as the crackle of the fire. It was a small sound, almost lost in the vast silence of the mountains, but to the writer it was reassuring. It meant the mind was still awake, still present, still fighting against the pull of despair. Each page filled was proof that the days had passed, that the man had endured one more night in the frozen wilderness. When dawn finally returned, pale and uncertain, the journals were closed and tucked away. They might be hidden under blankets, slipped into a leather pouch, or placed in a corner of the cabin, but they were always kept safe. For the mountain men knew these words mattered, not only to themselves, but perhaps to someone someday, who might read them and understand what it meant to live through such winters. The journals were more than ink and paper. They were quiet companions, keepers of memory, a voice in the silence. And through them, the lonely nights passed a little more gently, giving shape to the endless darkness and carrying the mountain men toward the first light of spring. For all their strength and patience, the mountain men were not made to live only in silence. The journals helped, yes, but even words on paper could not replace the sound of another voice, the sight of another figure moving against the snow. And so, as the months dragged on, the thought of meeting another trapper, someone who knew the same hardships, the same long winters, became a small light in the mind. It was not easy to find one another in such vast wilderness. Cabins were scattered across valleys, sometimes a week's travel apart, hidden in places chosen for shelter, or near the streams where beaver were plentiful. The storms made the mountains feel larger still, erasing trails overnight. Yet, men learned to recognize small signs: a curl of smoke rising between trees, the faint marks of snowshoes pressed into a drift, a trail of chopped wood half buried by the wind. These signs gave hope that someone else was near. The decision to seek another trapper was not made lightly. To leave one's cabin in winter was to face deep snow, biting, winds, and the risk of becoming lost. But the need for company could outweigh the danger. A man might pack a small bundle of dried meat, wrap himself in furs and set out slowly, leaning on his snowshoes following the sun when it appeared. Each step was a gamble, but the promise of hearing a voice after weeks of silence kept him moving forward. When two trappers met in the wilderness, the moment was quiet but filled with weight. There were no loud greetings, no embraces. Instead, a nod, a few words spoken low, and the fire of recognition in weary eyes. They would sit together near a fire, their shoulders hunched, their hands outstretched toward the flames. The talk came slowly, but it came, of hunts and storms, of wolves seen in the distance, of the meat they had smoked and the tools they had mended. The stories were simple, but they were a balm. There was comfort in knowing another man endured the same trials. It reminded each of them that survival was not theirs alone, that others fought the same cold, the same loneliness. In those rare meetings, silence was no longer heavy but restful, a shared quiet instead of a solitary one. Sometimes the men would trade, tobacco for powder, a strip of dried venison for a length of cord. Other times they exchanged only words, which were more valuable than any goods. On longer nights, they might share a pipe, the smoke curling upward into the beams of a cabin roof. One would speak while the other listened, and then the roles would shift. The rhythm of conversation eased the weight that each had carried for months. To laugh, even softly, was a rare luxury. It broke the stillness, like a bird's call across an empty valley. But always the visits were brief. Each man had his own traps to check, his own shelter to tend. Too long away from a cabin meant risking the fire's embers going cold or supplies running low. And so, after a few days, sometimes only a single night, they would part. The farewells were quiet, often just a clasp of hands or a final nod. One would turn back to his valley, the other to his ridge, each carrying the warmth of companionship into the silence that awaited. The memory of those encounters lingered long after. Back in his cabin, the trapper might sit by the fire and recall the rough voice of the other, the way the smoke curled as they talked, the simple comfort of not being alone for a time. That memory could last through many storms, giving strength when the nights grew long again. In this way, the mountain men endured not only with fire, food and shelter, but with the faint but vital threads of human connection. Each rare meeting was like a spark struck in the dark, a reminder that even in the vast silence of the mountains, a man was never completely alone. When at last the storms began to weaken, when the winds no longer howled through the valleys with their same merciless edge, the mountain men felt a quiet shift. Spring did not arrive suddenly in the high country. It crept in slowly, first as a trickle of water beneath the snow, then as patches of bare earth along the southern slopes. The rivers began to stir, breaking apart the ice with deep groans, carrying fragments of winter downstream. For the mountain men, this was not only a change of season, it was the signal to rise from survival into living again. Hunting, long hindered by storms and scarcity, opened once more. The trails of animals appeared in the soft earth, clear after months of being buried. Rabbits moved quickly through the brush, their winter-white coats shedding into shades of brown. Deer stepped cautiously into the meadows, lean from the cold season but alive, drawn to the new grass. The mountain men followed these signs with care, bow or rifle in hand, moving more freely now that the snow no longer clutched at their legs. Each successful hunt felt like renewal, as though both man and beast were returning to their natural rhythm after months of suspension. There was a different sound to the forest in spring. The rush of streams, the calls of returning birds, the crack of branches heavy with new buds. These sounds filled the silence that had weighed so heavily during the long nights. And with each hunt, the mountain men not only filled their larders, but also regained the strength that winter had worn down. Fresh meat, rich and warm, replaced the dry strips of venison that had sustained them. Bones boiled into broth carried warmth, deeper than fire alone could give. Yet hunting was not the only task. Spring was also the season to sow, to prepare the earth for what it could provide. Farming in the mountains was never easy, and few trappers relied on it fully, but many carved out small patches of soil near their cabins. With patience, they planted beans, corn, or hardy root vegetables. These little gardens were simple, but they gave balance to the uncertain gift of the hunt. The act of placing seed into earth was more than labour. It was a gesture of trust, a quiet belief that time and care would bring reward. The soil was often stony, the growing season short, but the men learned to work with what they had. They hauled water from streams, broke the earth with crude tools, and protected the fragile sprouts from animals. Day by day, the fields began to show green, a colour that carried hope after so much white. Watching a garden rise from the thawed ground gave a sense of order, a reminder that even in the wilderness, life could be coaxed from the earth with patience. This rhythm of spring, hunting in the forests, tending to small gardens near the cabin, brought a different kind of peace than winter survival. It was no longer about endurance alone, but about rebuilding, replenishing. The mountain men moved with slower breaths, their bodies less tense, their minds steadier. The days grew longer, carrying light into the evenings. The fire was still kept, but no longer as the sole defence against death. Now it burned for warmth, for comfort, as a companion to labour rather than a desperate shield. In those weeks, after the thaw, the mountain men often felt closest to the land itself. They saw the valleys awaken, rivers grow wild with melted snow, and forests alive with creatures testing the air. They were reminded that they too were part of this cycle, silent endurance in winter, steady rebuilding in spring. Though storms might come again, and hardships would always return, spring gave them a season of gentler work, of small victories not measured in survival alone. The hunts filled the storehouse, the gardens promised food for the future, and the earth itself seemed to whisper that endurance had meaning. The winter had been endured, and now, slowly, life returned. With the thaw of spring came not only the chance to hunt and sow, but also the quiet duty of repair. Winter left its mark on everything it touched. The cold, warped wood, rusted iron, split leather, and weakened the very walls that had stood against the storms. When the snow melted and the valleys stirred again, the mountain men turned their eyes to the things that had carried them through. Tools and cabins, battered but still standing, needed care. The work began with what was most essential, the cabin. Through the long months of winter, snow had pressed heavy on the roof, bending beams, loosening shingles, and letting in drifts of cold air. In the walls, the mud and grass once packed tightly between logs had dried, cracked, and fallen away. Sometimes whole logs showed signs of rot where the snow had sat too long against them. The mountain men would step outside, stand back, and study their shelters with the patient eye of someone who knew that survival depended not only on fire and food, but on the strength of those wooden walls. Repairs were slow, deliberate. Axes that had dulled in the cutting of winter wood were sharpened again. Whetstone pulled patiently across the blade until it gleamed. Fresh logs were brought down from the slopes, their barks stripped, their ends cut to fit into the old frame. With steady hands, men reset beams, hammered pegs, and sealed new gaps with mud mixed with straw or grass. Each blow of the mallet, each handful of earth pressed into a crack, was an act of renewal, restoring not only the cabin but also the sense of safety it gave. Inside, the hearth often needed mending. Stones shifted by heat and cold were set back into place. The chimney, sometimes clogged with soot or weakened by ice, was cleared and rebuilt where necessary. For men who had spent the winter leaning close to its warmth, the hearth was more than stone and ash. It was the heart of the cabin. To tend it now was to tend the memory of every fire that had kept them alive in the darkness. The tools, too, demanded attention. Traps dulled by months of use were filed and reset. Rifles, though carefully cleaned through the winter, still showed signs of wear, small cracks in wooden stocks, the faint beginning of a rust along metal. The mountain men polished, tightened, and tested them with quiet focus. Knives were honed sharp again, hatchets fitted with new handles, cords and straps mended with fresh sinew. To hold a tool in hand and restore it was to remember every time it had been relied upon, and to know it would be needed again soon. Sometimes repair meant invention. A broken pot might be patched with wire or reshaped into something new. A torn hide, once a cloak, could be stitched into smaller pieces for gloves or boots. Nothing was wasted. Every fragment of iron, every scrap of leather found its way back into usefulness. In the mountains, the act of repair was not just practical. It was a philosophy, a way of honouring the materials that had been hard-earned. The rhythm of these tasks gave shape to the days. In the mornings, men might check their traps or hunt for fresh meat. By midday, when the sun grew warmer, they worked with tools and timber, their cabins filling with the sound of hammering, scraping, and the soft thud of mud pressed between logs. In the evenings, the cabin stood a little stronger, the tools a little sharper, and the men themselves felt steadier, as though each repair on the outside reflected a repair within. There was a quiet satisfaction in the work. The cabins were never perfect, the tools never flawless, but each mended crack and sharpened edge carried the promise of endurance. It reminded the mountain men that survival was not only about facing storms, it was also about tending to what remained afterward, about strengthening the fragile things that had held through the cold. And so, with steady patience, the mountain men rebuilt their world each spring. The cabins, scarred but standing, rose firm again. The tools, polished and sharp, gleamed in the firelight. And with each task completed, the men felt themselves more ready for what the next season might bring. By the time the rivers ran free and the valleys turned green with summer, the mountain men began to think of the long journey out of solitude. The winter's trials had been endured, the cabins mended, the traps reset. Now came the season of rendezvous, a time when men left their lonely shelters and walked, sometimes for weeks, to meet others in the wide meadows chosen for trade. The journey itself carried a weight of ritual. Packs of furs collected through months of cold trapping were bundled tightly, tied with strips of hide, and loaded on the backs of mules or carried on crude sleds dragged across lingering patches of snow. Powder, shot and tools were counted carefully, for the road was not without risk. Yet despite the dangers, the thought of rendezvous drew men forward. It was the one time of year when the silence of the mountains gave way to the sound of voices. Arriving at the great gatherings was like stepping into another world. After months of quiet, the noise of so many men together was almost startling. The laughter, the calls, the steady hum of barter. Cabins and solitude gave way to open camps scattered across grassy fields. Fires smoked in every direction, their scents mingling. Roasting meat, pine wood burning, tobacco curling into the air. Here, trappers spread out their hard-won furs, sleek pelts of beaver, fox and marten, their sheen catching the sunlight. Traders from the cities and the riverboats came with goods the mountain men could not make for themselves. Powder and lead, knives and kettles, cloth and beads, even coffee and sugar. A man might exchange the work of an entire winter for a single rifle, or for enough supplies to see him through another year. Each trade was slow, deliberate, words weighed carefully, for both sides knew the value of what lay between them. But the rendezvous was more than barter. It was a return to human fellowship, rare and precious. Men who had not seen a familiar face in half a year now sat shoulder to shoulder, swapping stories of storms survived, animals hunted, and narrow escapes from hunger or wolves. The tales were told with the quiet weight of men who had endured them, not with boastful flourish. Around the firelight, one man's hardship became another's memory, and for a little while they were no longer alone in their struggles. There was music too, simple tunes played on fiddles brought across mountains, their notes carrying into the night air. Pipes were passed hand to hand, smoke drifting upward like prayer. Some men laughed until their sides ached. Others sat in silence, watching the fire, comforted by the mere presence of company. Even those who spoke little found peace in listening, in knowing that their solitude was shared. For a few days, the rendezvous gave the mountain men something the wilderness never could, the feeling of belonging to a larger world. Supplies replenished, spirits lifted, they stood a little taller, their minds steadier. Yet all knew it could not last. When the last furs were traded and the final handshakes given, each man would turn back toward his valley, his cabin, his traps. The mountains called them home again, to silence and endurance. As they left, their packs heavier with powder, cloth and tools, the memory of the rendezvous lingered. It was enough to carry them through the next long winter, the echo of voices, the warmth of shared fire, the rare joy of being one among many. These gatherings were not just about trade, but about survival of another kind, the survival of the spirit, renewed by fellowship before returning once more to the solitude of the high country. Thank you, dear listener, for wandering with me tonight through the quiet snows of history, through the frost-covered cabins and lonely trails of how mountain men survived harsh winter blizzards. Together we've walked softly in, their footsteps, hearing the hush of winter winds, and feeling the patience and courage that carried them through nights colder than most of us will ever know. It's peaceful now, here at the end of our story. The blizzard fading, the fire low, the silence wrapping everything in a soft white blanket. Wherever you are now, may your night be just as still as theirs once was. If you've enjoyed this quiet journey, you are welcome to subscribe, only if it feels right for you. A gentle way of keeping these calm histories close for whenever you need them. And now, let the snow fall softly in your mind. Let the candlelight grow dim, and let your thoughts settle like drifting flakes over a resting world. May the night carry you into warmth, into dreams, into peace. Good night, and sleep well.